The gate went quiet the moment the red light blinked on. "Ma'am, stop right there." The words cut through the private terminal like a blade. Conversations faltered. Shoes slowed. Somewhere behind the glass wall, a jet engine idled low and impatient, like an animal held back by a chain. Evelyn Brooks froze mid-step. She was standing at the edge of the jet bridge at Hamilton Executive Airfield, a small but elite private airport tucked outside Tampa, Florida. The morning sun spilled through the high windows, washing the polished concrete floor in pale gold. The air smelled faintly of fuel leather and fresh coffee from the pilot lounge. Evelyn didn't turn right away. She felt the eyes before she heard the footsteps. She felt the judgment settle on her shoulders like weight. She wore a light denim jacket, faded at the seams, a plain navy blouse, slacks pressed carefully but old, sensible walking shoes scuffed at the toes. In her left hand, a canvas tote bag. In her right, a folded boarding document that hadn't been scanned yet. Nothing about her looked urgent, or important, or expensive. She turned slowly. The man blocking her path was a gate operations supervisor, late 40s, broad shoulders straining against a neatly pressed polo with the airport logo stitched over the chest. His name badge read Thomas Reed. His jaw was set. His eyes flicked down to her shoes, then back up to her face. "I need you to step aside," he said. Not angry, not kind, controlled. "There's an issue with clearance." A few feet away, another employee stopped pushing a baggage cart. A pair of older passengers, both silver-haired, paused mid-conversation. A woman in a cream blazer adjusted her sunglasses, openly staring now. Evelyn's throat tightened. "I was told to proceed to the aircraft," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the faint rasp of nerves. They said boarding would begin early. Thomas Reed exhaled through his nose. He held out his hand, palm up, not touching her, but close enough to signal authority. "This flight is under private charter protocol. We can't have anyone on the bridge without final verification." "I understand," Evelyn said. "I can wait." She stepped back half a pace. It should have ended there. A pause. A check. A quiet resolution. It didn't. From behind Thomas, a woman's heels clicked sharply against the floor. Deliberate. Fast. The sound alone carried impatience. "What's the delay?" Linda Carver, ground operations manager. Early 50s. Tall. Impeccably dressed in tailored slacks and a crisp white blouse that never seemed to wrinkle. Her hair was pulled back tight, not a strand out of place. She ran Hamilton Executive like a machine, and she expected people to fall in line or move out of the way. Thomas didn't look relieved to see her. He looked cautious. "There's a clearance mismatch," he said quietly. "Her name isn't on the active manifest yet." Linda's eyes moved to Evelyn, moved to... They swept her once, head to toe, fast, efficient, final. "This area is restricted," Linda said. Her tone was smooth, professional, empty of warmth. "Ma'am, you'll need to return to the general waiting area until we sort this out." Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks. She glanced past Linda through the glass toward the runway. The jet sat there in the distance. White fuselage, dark blue stripe, engines humming low, ready. She had been early on purpose. She always was. Old habit. Avoid crowds. Avoid attention. She preferred to be invisible. Now she was standing in the center of it. "I'm not trying to cause a problem," Evelyn said. Her fingers tightened around the canvas strap. "If there's a mistake, I'm sure it can be cleared up quickly." Linda's smile flickered. "Barely. A thin line." "That may be," she said. "But until it is, we can't have you here." Around them, the silence grew heavier. The woman in the cream blazer leaned toward her companion. "Did she walk into the wrong gate?" she murmured. "Not cruel, just curious, assessing." Another man older with a veteran's posture and a ball cap tucked under his arm frowned. He didn't speak. He watched Evelyn closely, something uneasy crossing his face. Evelyn felt it all. The quiet assumptions, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who is she supposed to be? She swallowed. For a brief moment, she considered pulling out her phone. One call, one sentence. This would all stop. She didn't. Instead, she nodded. All right. Linda turned, already satisfied. Thomas escort her back. The word escort landed harder than it should have. Thomas hesitated. Just a beat. He gestured toward a row of seats near the windows, not the general terminal, but close enough to keep her contained. Right over there, ma'am, he said. Evelyn walked. Slowly. Each step felt louder than the last. Her shoes tapped against the floor, echoing in the high ceiling space. She felt smaller with every pace. She sat down. The chair was cold. She set her tote at her feet and folded her hands in her lap, the way her mother had taught her decades ago. Posture. Dignity. Even when no one is watching. Especially then. Inside her chest burned. She had spent her life being overlooked. As a young woman in factories where men assumed she was an assistant. As an older employee pushed toward early retirement with polite smiles and closed doors. She had learned how to survive it, how to swallow it. But this was different. This wasn't a workplace slight or a social snub. This was a wall. Linda Carver walked away, already barking instructions into her headset. Thomas Reed stood a few steps back, arms crossed, eyes flicking between Evelyn and the runway. The jet engines grew louder. Someone nearby checked their watch. Minutes passed. Evelyn stared straight ahead, breathing slow, measured. She thought of the phone in her bag. She thought of the man who would step off that plane. She thought of what would happen when he didn't see her where she was supposed to be. A flicker of fear ran through her then, not for herself, for what was coming next. Because when that plane finished taxiing, when the cabin door opened, when the truth finally crossed that stretch of concrete between runway and gate, this quiet, controlled space was going to change, and everyone in it would feel it. The first voice to break the tension wasn't loud. It was clipped, irritated, and edged with authority. Why is my aircraft still parked? Heads turned. The man had entered from the glass corridor, connecting the executive office wing to the terminal floor. Late 60s. Tall though age had softened the sharpness of his frame. Gray hair cut short, not styled. No jacket. White dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled just enough to show he was used to work, not ceremony. His presence didn't announce itself. It pressed down. David Brooks stopped 3 steps inside the terminal. He didn't look angry. That was worse. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the room the way an inspector studies a cracked beam. Quiet, thorough, unforgiving. Linda Carver was already turning headset, still on. Sir, we're resolving a minor clearance. David lifted a hand. Not high. Just enough. Don't, he said. The word landed flat. Absolute. The terminal seemed to shrink around it. Thomas Reed straightened instinctively. The older passengers fell silent. Even the baggage card operator eased his foot off the pedal. David's gaze drifted past Linda, past Thomas, until it landed on the woman seated by the window. Evelyn. She hadn't moved, still upright, still composed. Her eyes lifted to meet his. For a fraction of a second, something crossed David's face. Not surprise, not relief, something heavier, like confirmation. He walked toward her. Each step echoed. The sound was measured, controlled, the sound of someone who never rushed, because nothing ever outran him. Linda stepped into his path. Mr. Brooks, I need to explain, David didn't slow. He didn't raise his voice. You've already explained enough, he said. Just not to me. Linda froze. David stopped beside Evelyn's chair. He looked down at her. Really looked. At the tight line of her mouth, the way her hands were folded too neatly, the faint tremor in her fingers she thought no one could see. "You all right?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. Once. "I'm fine." That answer cut deeper than any accusation. David turned back to the room. "All right," he said. "Someone tell me why my wife was redirected away from my aircraft." The word wife rippled through the terminal. Not gasps, not murmurs. Something colder. A shift. Linda's face drained of color. Not completely. Just enough to show the crack beneath the polish. "Sir," she said carefully, choosing each syllable as if stepping through glass. There was a discrepancy in the manifest. "We follow protocol." "We couldn't verify." David smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You couldn't verify what he asked, that a woman who has flown with me for 32 years knows where she's going." Linda swallowed. "We didn't know who she was. That, David said, is the problem." He turned slightly, addressing the room now. Not loud, not theatrical. His voice carried because it didn't need to fight. This airport serves people who believe money announces itself. It doesn't. Power doesn't either. It waits, and it watches. Thomas Reed shifted his weight. His jaw tightened. David's eyes flicked to him. "You're the supervisor on this gate." "Yes, sir." "Did my wife threaten security?" "No, sir." "Did she attempt to access restricted equipment?" "No, sir." "Did she refuse a lawful instruction?" Thomas hesitated. "No, sir." David nodded. "Then explain to me why she was removed from boarding access." Silence. Linda stepped in again too quickly. "Mr. Brooks, we acted to prevent a potential liability." "If an unauthorized individual boards," David's voice hardened. "My wife is not a liability." He turned to Evelyn. "Did anyone ask for your identification?" She hesitated. "They asked me to wait." David exhaled slowly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and unlocked it with one practiced motion. "Linda," he said, without looking at her, "do you know who owns Brooks Aviation Charter?" "Yes, of course," she said. "Your company. Do you know who funded the runway expansion here 12 years ago?" She nodded a fraction too late. "Yes." "And do you know whose aircraft accounts for nearly 40% of your annual private charter traffic?" The silence stretched. David finally looked at her. "Then, let me be clear. The woman you asked to step aside is not some oversight. She is the reason I built a company that didn't forget people like her." Linda's mouth opened, closed. Around them, the older passengers shifted uncomfortably. The woman in the cream blazer looked down at her hands. The man with the veteran's posture stared at the floor, shame tightening his expression. David turned to Thomas Reed. "You did your job by the book," he said. "But books don't teach judgment. They teach coverage." Thomas nodded stiffly. David turned back to Linda. "You, however, chose distance over decency." Linda's shoulders squared. "Sir, with respect, we can't make exceptions based on appearances." David's eyes sharpened. "You already did." The words struck like a verdict. "You made an exception to assume she didn't belong," he continued. "You made an exception to move her out of sight, so the process stayed clean. That wasn't protocol. That was convenience." Linda's hands trembled now. Just slightly. David looked around the terminal one last time. This place markets itself as discreet, but discretion without humanity is just a nicer word for exclusion. He turned back to Evelyn and held out his hand. "Let's go," he said. She took it. Her grip was warm, steady, stronger than he remembered. They walked together toward the gate. No one moved to stop them. Thomas stepped aside immediately. Linda didn't try again. As they reached the jet bridge, Evelyn paused. She turned back. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I know you were doing what you thought was right," she said, looking at Linda. "I just hope the next person you stop doesn't learn to feel small the way I did." Linda said nothing. The jet bridge door closed behind them with a soft hiss. Inside the cabin, the air was cool, calm, familiar. David guided Evelyn to her seat. She sat, finally letting her shoulders drop. Only then did her breath shake. "I didn't want to call you," she said. "I thought it would make it worse." David sat across from her. "You didn't make anything worse. You showed them exactly what they are." She looked out the window as the engines began to spool. "I'm tired," she said softly, "of always having to be patient." David nodded. "I know." The plane began to move. Back in the terminal, Linda Carver stood frozen, headset forgotten, watching the aircraft taxi toward the runway. Thomas Reed removed his badge, wiped his palm against his pants, and clipped it back on with care. The older passengers sat in silence, each lost in their own reflection. And as the jet lifted into the Florida sky, carrying Evelyn Brooks away from a place that had judged her wrong, one truth settled heavily over the terminal like a long shadow. Power hadn't shouted. It had simply stood up and walked past them. The fallout didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It came quietly, the way real consequences always do. 3 hours after the jet left Florida airspace, an internal email circulated through Hamilton Executive Airfield. No subject line, no branding. Just a short directive from Brooks Aviation Charter's legal office requesting a formal incident report, time-stamped, unedited, including audio logs, headset transcripts, and security camera footage from the gate area between 9:10 and 9:40 in the morning. Linda Carver read it twice. Her office felt smaller than it had an hour ago. Same glass walls, same desk, same framed certificate from the State Aviation Authority hanging slightly crooked behind her chair. But the air had changed, thicker, less forgiving. She closed the door. Her hands were steady as she reached for the incident log. Too steady. That bothered her more than panic would have. Panic meant denial. This felt like recognition. She began typing. On the terminal floor, Thomas Reed stood near the baggage corridor, pretending to review a clipboard he wasn't reading. His mind replayed the moment David Brooks had asked him a simple question and waited for the truth. No accusation, no trap, just space. Thomas had filled it with honesty. He wondered how many times he hadn't. A few yards away, the veteran with the ball cap approached the coffee kiosk, then stopped. He looked back toward the empty gate, shook his head slowly, and left without ordering anything. The silence lingered long after the aircraft was gone. By the time Evelyn Brooks stepped off the jet in Denver, the tension she'd carried all morning had settled into something heavier, not anger, not relief, something closer to grief. The car ride into the city passed in near silence. David drove. Evelyn watched the mountains rise against the horizon, their edges sharp and unforgiving. She loved that about Colorado. Nothing pretended to be gentle. "They'll call," she said finally. David nodded. "I know. I don't want apologies," she added. "I don't want anyone punished because of me." David glanced at her. "This isn't because of you. It's because of what they built around themselves." That night after dinner, Evelyn sat alone in the living room, a blanket draped across her knees. She turned the television on, then off again. Her thoughts kept circling back to the terminal, to the way Linda's eyes had flickered, not with malice, but with fear of losing control. Evelyn understood that fear. She'd lived with it for decades. The fear of being unseen. The fear of becoming irrelevant. The fear that if you loosen your grip, everything slips away. Her phone buzzed softly on the side table. Unknown number. She let it ring once more before answering. "Hello?" "Mrs. Brooks," a woman's voice said. Calm, Professional. This is Karen Holt from Hamilton Executive's Compliance Office. I wanted to personally apologize, for Evelyn closed her eyes. Please don't. A pause. I'm sorry. Evelyn's voice softened. I know you're doing your job, but I'm not calling to be reassured. I'm calling because I want you to listen. Another pause, longer this time. I didn't feel threatened today, Evelyn continued. I felt dismissed. And that stays with people longer than fear ever does. Karen exhaled slowly. I understand. I hope you do, Evelyn said, because the next person might not have someone waiting on a jet. The call ended politely, cleanly. No promises, no drama. In Florida, Linda Carver stayed late. Long after the terminal lights dimmed and the cleaning crew moved through with quiet efficiency, she sat at her desk, reviewing the footage. She watched herself on screen. The way she'd approached. The way she'd stood just far enough away to maintain authority. The way she'd spoken Evelyn's name, without ever asking it. She paused the video. For the first time in years, Linda felt something crack beneath the armor she'd built. Not guilt, awareness. Her phone vibrated. Private number. She answered. Linda Carver. Ms. Carver, a man said. His voice was level, measured. This is James Whitaker from Brooks Aviation's board. Linda straightened instinctively. Yes, sir. We're not here to discuss disciplinary action, he continued. We're here to discuss patterns. Her breath caught. Your airport has an exceptional safety record, James said. But safety isn't just mechanical, it's cultural. And culture leaks. Linda swallowed. What are you asking? We're asking you to help us identify where discretion becomes exclusion, he said, and whether you're willing to change it. Linda closed her eyes. For the first time since she'd taken this job, she didn't reach for the right answer. She reached for the honest one. I don't know if I've ever been taught how, she said. James paused. Then we'll start there. Across the country, Thomas Reed sat at his kitchen table, staring at his dinner untouched. His wife watched him quietly from the sink. You look like someone finally asked you a question you couldn't dodge, she said. He nodded. I think I did the right thing today. And I'm not sure I've done enough of that. She dried her hands and sat across from him. Then maybe tomorrow you do a little more. Thomas smiled faintly. 2 weeks later, Hamilton Executive announced a revised boarding protocol. It didn't mention names. It didn't reference incidents. It simply outlined new language, new pauses, new expectations. The words dignity and discretion appeared side by side for the first time. Some employees rolled their eyes. Others read it twice. Linda Carver stood in the training room, facing a small group of supervisors. She didn't stand behind the podium. She stood with them. I've been very good at enforcing rules, she said, and very bad at asking why they exist. No one interrupted. I don't want another day like that one, she continued. Not for you. Not for the people who walk through our doors. The room stayed quiet. And somewhere between Florida and Colorado, something subtle shifted. Not the system, not yet, but the people inside it. Evelyn Brooks never returned to Hamilton Executive Airfield. She didn't need to, but long after her flight, long after the emails and meetings and carefully worded changes, her presence remained, not as a warning, not as a legend, as a question. And for the first time in a long time, that question was being asked out loud. The first sign that the story wasn't finished came quietly folded inside a routine meeting agenda. David Brooks noticed it halfway through a board review in Denver, a single line buried beneath maintenance forecasts and quarterly charter projections. Hamilton Executive Airfield. Community Advisory Request. His eyes lingered on the words longer than they should have. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Across town, Evelyn Brooks sat at the kitchen table, sorting through old photographs she had meant to organize for years. Black and white prints. A younger version of herself in a windbreaker beside a hangar. David lean and sunburned, laughing at something off camera. Planes that no longer flew, people who no longer called. Her phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. "Hello," Mrs. Brooks, Linda Carver said. Her voice was different now, less armored, still controlled, but careful, as if each word had weight. "Thank you for taking my call. I know you don't owe me your time." Evelyn closed her eyes. For a moment, she considered letting the silence answer for her. Then she spoke. "Why are you calling?" Linda didn't deflect. "Because I can't stop thinking about the way you looked at me before you left. Not angry, just disappointed. And because we're about to make changes that will look good on paper, but mean nothing unless someone reminds us why they matter." Evelyn listened. She could hear the effort in Linda's breathing, the restraint, the pride, struggling not to interfere. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn asked. "I want you to tell me what I missed," Linda said. "Not as a complaint, as a person." The kitchen clock ticked loudly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. She thought of all the moments in her life when she had stayed quiet, when she had let discomfort pass because it was easier than confrontation. She thought of the woman who would come through that gate next month, or next year, alone, uncertain. "All right," she said. "But I won't do it gently." Linda exhaled. "I wouldn't expect you to." They agreed to meet. Not at the airport, not on neutral ground. At a diner, just off the highway, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never tasted quite right. When Linda arrived, she was early. No blazer, no heels, just a sweater and flats. She sat stiffly, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Evelyn walked in 5 minutes later. Same denim jacket, same quiet presence. She slid into the booth across from Linda, without ceremony. For a moment, neither spoke. "You saw me as a problem," Evelyn said finally. Not accusatory, just factual. "Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I didn't fit your picture." Linda nodded slowly. "Yes. That picture," Evelyn continued, "is what protects you. It tells you who matters before they open their mouth. It's efficient. And it's wrong." Linda swallowed. "I've spent my career preventing mistakes." "And I spent mine fixing them," Evelyn said. "Different jobs. Same goal. But you can't fix what you refuse to see." The waitress arrived, took orders, left. Life moved on around them indifferent. "I wasn't afraid of security," Evelyn said. "I was afraid of becoming invisible." Again. Linda's jaw tightened. "You weren't invisible." Evelyn met her eyes. "You didn't ask my name." The words landed heavier than anything else she could have said. Linda looked down at her hands. For a long time, she said nothing. "I don't want to be that person," she said finally, "but I built a system that rewards her." Evelyn nodded, then changed the reward. The conversation lasted over an hour. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, just clarity and discomfort, and something like respect earned slowly, carefully. 2 weeks later, Hamilton Executive hosted its first open forum. No press, no announcements, just employees, supervisors, and a handful of community members. Linda stood at the front of the room and spoke without notes. "We are very good at moving aircraft," she said. "We have been less good at moving ourselves." Some shifted uncomfortably. Others listened. She didn't mention Evelyn by name. She didn't have to. Thomas Reed sat in the third row. He watched the way Linda paused before certain words, the way she didn't rush through the hard parts. He felt something settle in his chest, relief, maybe even pride. After the meeting, he approached her. "If you ever need someone to slow things down," he said, "I'm willing." Linda smiled. I know. Across the country, David Brooks watched the ripples spread. He read the reports. He attended the calls. He said very little. When asked what he wanted from the airport moving forward, he answered simply, consistency. They understood what he meant. Months passed. The story faded from headlines because there were no headlines to begin with. But inside Hamilton Executive the changes held. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but they held. One morning, nearly a year later, an older woman arrived early for a charter flight. She wore a thrifted coat and carried a canvas bag. She stood at the gate uncertain. Thomas Reed approached her. Good morning, he said. What's your name? She told him. Welcome, he said. Let's get you where you need to be. No one stared. No one whispered. The jet departed on time. Evelyn Brooks never heard about that woman. She didn't need to. She and David sat on their porch in the evenings now, watching the light fade over the hills. Sometimes they talked about planes. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. One night, Evelyn said quietly, I'm glad I stayed seated. David nodded. Me too. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't to demand entry. It's to wait long enough for the door to realize it was wrong to close. The call came on a Tuesday morning, the kind that felt ordinary until it wasn't. Evelyn Brooks was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug, when her phone buzzed against the counter. Unknown number again. She stared at it longer this time, as if the phone itself carried intention. She answered. Hello? Mrs. Brooks, a male voice said, careful, measured, practiced. This is Michael Garner with the Federal Aviation Administration. I'm calling regarding a formal inquiry tied to Hamilton Executive Airfield. Evelyn closed her eyes. Yes, she said. I expected this. There was a pause on the other end. Then you understand this call is not about courtesy. It's about process. I understand, Evelyn replied. It always is. Michael Garner cleared his throat. We've received multiple independent reports over the past year concerning discretionary gate practices at Hamilton Executive. Your name came up as a reference point, not a complaint, a pattern. Evelyn dried her hands slowly. What do you need from me? We need context, he said, not what happened, why it was allowed to happen. That afternoon, in a conference room in Denver, with walls of glass and a view of the Rockies cut sharp against the sky, David Brooks sat across from two FAA auditors and one quiet woman from the Department of Transportation. No one mentioned Evelyn yet. They talked instead about policies, about procedures, about liability thresholds, and discretionary authority. David listened. When they finally asked Mr. Brooks, why didn't you escalate the incident immediately, he answered without hesitation. Because the moment I did it would have become about me, and it needed to be about them. The auditors exchanged a glance. Back in Florida, Linda Carver sat alone in her car in the parking lot engine, off hands on the steering wheel. She had received the notice that morning. Federal review. Full scope. Voluntary cooperation requested. Mandatory cooperation implied. She laughed once. Short, humorless. So this is what it feels like, she murmured, not fear, but exposure. Inside the terminal, the mood shifted before any official announcement. Employees sensed it, the way animals sense weather. Conversations grew quieter. Procedures were followed more carefully. Smiles became deliberate. Thomas Reed noticed it immediately. A junior coordinator approached him that afternoon. Is this because of that woman last year? She asked in a low voice. Thomas didn't answer right away. He thought of Evelyn sitting by the window. He thought of the question David Brooks had asked him, and the relief that had followed honesty. It's because of all of us, he said finally. The FAA team arrived the following week. Ray, no uniforms, no spectacle, clipboards, Laptops, long days, longer silences. They interviewed staff, reviewed footage, compared policies to practice. When Linda Carver sat across from them, she didn't defend herself. She didn't confess either. She explained, slowly, carefully. She spoke about training that prioritized risk elimination over human judgment, about pressure from clients who paid for silence, not empathy, about a culture that rewarded smooth outcomes, not right ones. One auditor leaned back in his chair. You understand, intent doesn't erase impact. Linda nodded. I do now. Meanwhile, Evelyn found herself remembering moments she hadn't thought about in years. The first time she'd been asked to step aside in a factory break room because someone assumed she was lost. The meeting where her suggestion had been repeated by a man and praised as brilliant. The quiet accumulation of moments that taught her how to shrink without disappearing. When Michael Garner called again, she spoke plainly. The system didn't fail, she said. It worked exactly as it was designed. It just wasn't designed for people like me. That sentence made it into the final report. 3 months later, the findings were released. No fines, no shutdowns, something more unsettling. A mandated restructuring of discretionary authority training across all executive airfields in the region. A new requirement for documented human-centered intervention points. Language about implicit bias embedded not as an accusation, but as a risk factor. Hamilton Executive was named once, not condemned, cited. Linda Carver read the report alone in her office. She didn't feel anger or relief. She felt something like grief for the version of herself that had believed control was the same as competence. She resigned 2 weeks later, not in disgrace, quietly, with a letter that surprised everyone, including herself. I no longer trust myself to lead from this position, she wrote, and leadership without trust is management, not stewardship. Thomas Reed was offered her role. He declined. Instead, he accepted a newly created position overseeing training and gate protocol consistency across multiple locations. Less power, more influence. The first time he stood in front of a room of new hires, he didn't start with rules. He started with a question. Who decides who belongs? He asked, and why? In Denver, David and Evelyn watched the news coverage fade. There were no headlines. Just a brief mention in an industry bulletin. Most people never heard the story. That suited Evelyn fine. One evening, she and David attended a small community event at the local library. A retired school teacher spoke about dignity in public spaces. Evelyn listened from the back row. Afterward, a woman approached her. Late 60s. Nervous smile. I don't know why, the woman said, but when you were sitting there, I felt like I could breathe. Evelyn took her hand. So did I. Months later, a new gate supervisor at Hamilton Executive stopped an elderly man who'd wandered too close to a restricted area. The supervisor didn't raise his voice. He didn't redirect him away. He walked with him. The man's daughter later sent an email thanking the airport for treating her father like a person, not a problem. The message was forwarded to a training file, not as praise, as reference. On a clear autumn morning, Evelyn Brooks boarded a small charter flight out of Denver. Different airport, different staff, same early arrival. As she handed over her boarding document, the agent smiled. Good morning, Mrs. Brooks. We're ready for you. Evelyn paused. Just a moment, long enough to feel the weight of it. Then she nodded and walked forward. Not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because somewhere along the way it had learned how to listen. The storm didn't announce itself. It never does when it's been building for years. It arrived as a letter, thick paper official seal, slid quietly into the mailbox of Brooks Aviation Charter on a cold Monday morning. David Brooks found it when he arrived, before sunrise coat, still on coffee untouched. He recognized the return address immediately. Not fear, recognition. He sat down before opening it. Inside, the language was precise, clinical, almost polite. A congressional subcommittee on transportation ethics was requesting testimony, not subpoenaed. Requested. Voluntary, they said. But David had spent a lifetime reading between lines. Voluntary was an illusion when power wanted answers. They were no longer looking at Hamilton Executive Airfield. They were looking at the industry. By noon, the calls began. Former partners, legal advisors, one old friend who hadn't spoken to him in years. Some warned him to stay quiet. Others urged him to control the narrative. A few more honest than the rest asked how bad it could get. David answered none of them right away. That evening, he sat across from Evelyn at their dining table, the letter between them. She read it slowly, once, twice. Her face didn't change. "So this is what it becomes," she said. "Yes," David replied, "bigger than us." Evelyn traced the edge of the paper with her finger. "Then it was never really about me." "No," he said gently. "It was about what you exposed." She looked up. "And what will you do?" David didn't hesitate. "Tell the truth." She studied him. "All of it." "Yes." The hearing was scheduled for early spring in Washington, D.C. A city David knew well, though he'd never loved it. Too much noise. Too many people mistaking proximity for power. The day of the hearing, the room filled slowly. Lawmakers, staffers, industry representatives in dark suits. Cameras positioned carefully, not for spectacle, but for record. Evelyn sat behind David, hands folded, posture straight. She hadn't been asked to speak. She hadn't expected to. But she was there because absence would have been louder. When David took the oath, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the panel. The questions came measured at first. Safety protocols, charter oversight, market concentration. He answered them all calmly, precisely, without embellishment. Then a congresswoman from Oregon leaned forward. Late 50s, sharp eyes, no patience for theater. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "your name entered this discussion not because of a crash or a violation, but because of a woman who was asked to step aside." The room stilled. "Yes," David said. Why she asked did that moment matter? David paused. Because he said systems reveal themselves not when they fail catastrophically, but when they inconvenience the powerless. A murmur rippled through the room. He continued. That gate wasn't unsafe. It wasn't under threat. It was under judgment. And judgment, when left unchecked, becomes policy. Another lawmaker leaned in. Are you suggesting discrimination? I'm suggesting, David replied, that discretion without accountability always favors the familiar. He spoke for nearly an hour, not defending his company, not condemning Hamilton Executive. He spoke about incentives, about silence, about how industries built for speed forget how to stop. When asked if he believed federal oversight was necessary, he answered simply, only where conscience has been outsourced. Behind him, Evelyn listened, not with pride, with gravity. After the hearing, as reporters gathered in the hallway, one asked Evelyn how it felt to be the catalyst for reform. She shook her head. I wasn't a catalyst, she said. I was a mirror. The coverage that followed was uneven. Some outlets framed it as accountability. Others called it overreach. A few dismissed it as a personal grievance inflated by wealth. Evelyn read none of it. Instead, she received letters. Handwritten. Emails printed out by grandchildren. Messages from people who had waited quietly their entire lives. A retired nurse who had been escorted out of a corporate lobby because she didn't have an appointment, even though she'd been invited. A widower who was asked to leave a private terminal restroom because he didn't look like he belonged. A former engineer who stopped flying private altogether because he was tired of being assessed before being greeted. They didn't ask for justice. They thanked her for recognition. Meanwhile, the industry shifted reluctantly. Training modules were rewritten, language softened, policies clarified. Some executives complained about bureaucracy. Others quietly admitted relief. At Hamilton, Executive Thomas Reed stood in the new observation room, watching the flow of passengers. He saw fewer glances linger. Fewer shoulders tense. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. One afternoon, a junior employee asked him, "Do you think people will forget why we changed?" Thomas shook his head. "Not if we keep telling the story wrong." "What do you mean?" "If we say it was about money, they'll forget," Thomas said. "If we say it was about dignity, they'll remember." Linda Carver watched the hearings from her small apartment miles away from the airport. She had taken a consulting role, advising on operational ethics, fewer hours, less pay, more sleep. She watched Evelyn on the screen, sitting quietly behind David, and felt something unexpected: gratitude. Months later, Evelyn and David were invited to speak at a small aviation ethics symposium. David declined. Evelyn accepted. When she stood at the podium, the room leaned in. "I was raised to believe that being patient was the same as being polite," she said. "It took me a lifetime to learn that patience without voice is just silence." She didn't accuse. She didn't instruct. She told a story about a chair by a window, about waiting, about what it costs to be dismissed. When she finished, the room stayed quiet longer than applause ever could. That night, back at the hotel, Evelyn stood at the window, watching planes lift into the dark. David joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I think so." He smiled faintly. "You changed more than you know." She leaned into him. "No," she said. "I reminded them." Outside, another aircraft rose steady and deliberate, its lights blinking against the night. And for the first time in a long time, the sky felt wide enough for everyone. The invitation arrived without ceremony, slipped between utility bills and a handwritten note from a neighbor. Cream envelope. No logo, just her name spelled correctly for once. Evelyn Brooks held it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single card. A private dedication ceremony at Hamilton Executive Airfield. No press. No speeches. An acknowledgement, the note said, of procedural reform and community accountability. Attendance optional. David watched her from the doorway. "You don't have to go." "I know," she said. Her fingers traced the edge of the card. "That's why I might." They flew to Florida a week later, this time on a commercial flight. Evelyn insisted. She wanted the long walk through the terminal. The waiting. The noise. The ordinary weight of travel that most people carried without noticing. Hamilton Executive looked the same from the outside. Clean lines, trimmed hedges, glass that reflected the sky so perfectly it almost disappeared. But inside the rhythm had changed. Subtle, like a song played in a lower key. Thomas Reed met them near the entrance. He wore the same uniform, but it fit differently now, as if he'd grown into it instead of hiding behind it. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. Not rushed, not rehearsed. "Thank you for coming." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." They walked together toward the conference wing. As they passed the gate area, Evelyn slowed. The chair by the window was still there. Same angle, same light. Someone else sat in it now, an older man, reading a folded newspaper, unbothered, unobserved. Her chest tightened. The ceremony itself was brief. No applause, no plaques. A statement read aloud about revised practices and shared responsibility. A recognition of harm without naming it directly. Evelyn stood at the back. She hadn't come to be seen. Afterward, as people mingled awkwardly with coffee cups and polite smiles, a woman approached her, late 70s maybe, hair white and neatly pinned, hands trembling just slightly. "I was here the day it happened," the woman said. I didn't say anything. Evelyn met her eyes. "I know." The woman swallowed. "I think about that." "So do I," Evelyn replied. "But we're both here now." Across the room, Linda Carver hovered near the exit. She hadn't planned on staying. But when their eyes met, Linda stepped forward. "I didn't expect you to come," she said, quietly. "I didn't expect to be invited," Evelyn answered. They stood facing each other, not adversaries now, not allies either. Just two women, shaped by systems that had asked too much of them in different ways. "I'm still learning," Linda said. "What to let go of." Evelyn nodded. "So am I." Outside, the Florida heat pressed down heavy and familiar. David waited by the car, while Evelyn lingered near the edge of the runway. A jet lifted off its roar, sudden, violent, then gone. For a moment, she felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to shrink, to step back. She didn't. On the drive back to the hotel, David asked, "Was it worth it?" Evelyn watched palm trees blur past the window. "I don't know," she said. But it was honest. That night, she couldn't sleep. The hotel room was too quiet, too clean. She sat on the edge of the bed, thinking of all the versions of herself that had learned to wait, to endure, to be reasonable. She thought of the letters she still received, of the people who saw themselves in her silence. By morning, she had made a decision. Back home in Colorado, Evelyn began saying yes to things she had once declined. A community forum at the library, a small mentorship program for older workers re-entering the job market, a conversation with a local paper that promised not to sensationalize. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but it carried weight now, not because it was louder, because it was chosen. David watched the change with quiet admiration. He knew better than to interfere. This was her work. One afternoon, months later, Evelyn stood at a modest podium in a town hall auditorium. No cameras, just folding chairs filled with people who had lived long enough to be dismissed more than once. "I'm not here to tell you to fight," she said. "I'm here to tell you that your presence already does." A man in the front row raised his hand. "What if they still don't listen?" Evelyn smiled, small but certain. "Then we keep standing where they can see us." The applause was slow, earned. After the event, a young woman approached her, nervous, hopeful. "Do you think it's ever too late to matter?" Evelyn took her hands. "Only if you decide it is." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Evelyn and David sat on their porch again. The air was cool. The world felt quieter than it used to. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Evelyn said. David nodded. "I know. But I'm not running from it either," she continued. "Not anymore." He smiled. That's the difference. Somewhere in Florida, a new hire at Hamilton Executive greeted an elderly couple by name. Somewhere else, a supervisor paused before making an assumption. Somewhere else, still, someone waited by a window and was seen. The changes didn't ripple outward all at once. They settled. They rooted. They grew where they were allowed to. Evelyn Brooks had once been asked to step aside. Now she stood exactly where she belonged, and the world slowly learned to adjust. The first time Evelyn Brooks noticed the backlash, it wasn't loud. It was careful. It showed up as a comment, buried deep beneath a local opinion piece, written by someone who never used their real name. It accused her of exaggeration, of leveraging her husband's status, of turning a misunderstanding into a movement. Evelyn read it once, then again, not because it hurt, but because it sounded familiar. That tone had existed long before her. David saw it too. He said nothing at first. He had learned that not every fire needed oxygen, but the backlash didn't stay online. At a regional aviation conference in Phoenix, a panel discussion shifted unexpectedly. A senior executive, polished and confident, leaned into his microphone and said, "We need to be careful not to let anecdotal discomfort dictate operational policy." The room murmured in agreement. A few heads turned toward Evelyn, seated quietly in the second row. She didn't flinch. After the panel, a man approached her. Early 60s, expensive watch, smile too practiced. "No offense?" He said, lowering his voice, "but some of us feel this has gone a little far." Evelyn studied him. "Far from what?" "From efficiency," he replied. "From how things have always worked." She nodded slowly. "That's usually where progress starts." He laughed, uncomfortable. "You know what I mean." "Yes," she said, "I do." The tension followed her home. It followed her into grocery stores, into town halls, into conversations that used to feel neutral. She had become a reference point, whether she wanted to or not. One evening, sitting at her kitchen table, Evelyn admitted something she hadn't said aloud before. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry this long term." David didn't try to reassure her. He didn't minimize it. "Then don't carry it alone." The next morning, Evelyn received an email from a woman named Ruth Alvarez, a retired transit supervisor from California. Ruth wrote plainly. She had been asked to leave a commuter lounge because she didn't match the expected profile. She hadn't made a scene. She had gone home and cried. "I thought it was just me," Ruth wrote. "Then I heard your name." Evelyn replied within the hour. That exchange became another. Then another. A retired dock worker, a former airline dispatcher, a woman who had worked security for decades and still been treated like an intruder when she walked through the wrong door. Evelyn didn't collect their stories. She didn't catalog their pain. She listened, and slowly, without planning it, a network formed. Not a movement, not an organization, just people who had been quiet long enough. They met online at first. Small calls, no agenda, no branding, just voices, faces lined with years, shared recognition. One night, during a call that ran longer than planned, someone asked, "What do we do now?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. "We keep showing up," she said finally, "and we stop apologizing for being there." The pushback intensified. An industry group released a statement emphasizing operational neutrality. Another warned of emotional overcorrection. A columnist wrote that dignity was important, but that business required tough lines. Evelyn read none of it directly. She heard about it through others. What she did read were the messages from people who felt less alone. At Hamilton Executive, the atmosphere shifted again, not backward, sideways, subtler. Some employees grew defensive, others leaned in harder. Thomas Reed noticed the strain. He watched colleagues struggle with the fear of doing the wrong thing now that the rules were no longer invisible. He addressed it head-on during a training session. "You're not being asked to guess," he said. "You're being asked to see." One young hire raised her hand. "What if we mess up?" Thomas smiled. "Then you learn. That's better than pretending you didn't." Meanwhile, Linda Carver, watching from a distance, reached out to Evelyn again. Not for advice, for honesty. "I thought stepping away would be enough," Linda said, during a long phone call. "But I keep realizing how much of myself was tied to that authority." Evelyn listened. "Authority isn't who you are," she said. "It's what you borrow and what you give back." Linda was quiet for a long time. "I wish I'd known that sooner." "So do most of us," Evelyn replied. The real turning point came unexpectedly during a televised hearing on transportation access. Evelyn had not been invited. She watched from her living room, wrapped in a blanket, tea cooling beside her. Midway through the session, a senator held up a printed letter. This was written by a retired aircraft inspector, he said. She didn't ask for policy changes. She asked to be treated like she belonged. Evelyn recognized her own words. Not the letter. The language. The senator continued. We talk a lot about innovation. But the most radical thing we can do is refuse to erase people who built the systems we benefit from. Evelyn felt her breath catch. After the broadcast, her phone buzzed nonstop. She didn't answer. She sat quietly, letting the moment pass through her without claiming it. That night, she walked outside alone. The sky was clear. Planes crossed overhead, distant, steady. She thought about how close she had come to staying silent. How easy it would have been to let that day at the gate fade into a story she told no one. Instead, it had followed her, changed her, challenged her. And now it was pushing back. David joined her on the porch. You okay? She nodded. I think I'm learning something. What? That discomfort is a sign, she said. Not of being wrong, but of being visible. He smiled. Visibility has a cost. Yes, she said, but invisibility costs more. In the weeks that followed, the backlash softened, not because it lost conviction, but because it lost clarity. The story was no longer about one woman. It was about too many to dismiss. Evelyn didn't celebrate that. She prepared for what came next, because change, she knew now, didn't end with acceptance. It ended with endurance. The day the story stopped belonging to her arrived without warning. Evelyn Brooks realized it halfway through a community meeting in a small Colorado town she had never visited before. Folding chairs filled a high school auditorium. A local moderator spoke about access, about fairness, about learning to see people who had been overlooked. Evelyn sat near the aisle, anonymous, grateful for it. Then someone in the audience raised a hand and said her name. Not loudly, not reverently, casually. As if she were a shared reference point, a chapter everyone had already read. Evelyn felt the shift immediately, the way heads turned, the way the room subtly reoriented around her presence. She felt something loosen in her chest, not fear but distance. This was no longer just her story. After the meeting, a man approached her, mid-70s. Bent slightly at the shoulders. His hands shook as he spoke. I worked maintenance at a rail yard for 40 years, he said. Last month, they told me I couldn't sit in the employee lounge anymore. Said it was for active staff only. I didn't argue. I just left. He paused, eyes wet but steady. Then I heard about you. Evelyn took a breath. What did you hear? That sometimes he said, standing where you are is enough. She nodded slowly. Sometimes it is. On the flight home, Evelyn stared out the window as the landscape shifted beneath her. Mountains flattening into plains, plains dissolving into city lights. She felt a strange mixture of pride and grief. Pride for the impact, grief for the simplicity she had lost. That night, she admitted it to David. I miss being unknown. He didn't answer right away. He understood the cost of being recognized by strangers who felt entitled to your meaning. Do you want to stop? He asked gently. Evelyn considered the question carefully. No, she said, but I want to change how I carry it. The opportunity came from an unexpected place. A nonprofit focused on elder advocacy reached out not with a request for endorsement, but with an invitation. They wanted Evelyn to help design a listening initiative. Not a campaign, not a platform. A series of closed-door conversations between institutions and the people who had aged inside them. They don't need another voice, the director said. They need someone who knows when to be quiet. Evelyn said, yes. The first session took place in a rented library room in Kansas City. No press, no recording. Just a circle of chairs. On one side, representatives from transportation hubs, hospitals, municipal offices. On the other, retirees, widows, veterans, caregivers. Evelyn didn't open with a speech. She opened with a question. When was the last time you felt invisible? The room answered. Stories spilled out. Not dramatic, not viral. The slow erosion of dignity through small denials. A woman who stopped traveling because security procedures made her feel like a burden. A man who no longer attended public meetings because he was always asked if he was lost. Evelyn listened, took notes, asked follow-ups. When tensions rose, she didn't smooth them over. She let the discomfort sit. After the session, one institutional representative pulled her aside. This is harder than I thought, he admitted. I didn't realize how often our systems ask people to disappear. Evelyn nodded. Most harm isn't loud. That's why it lasts. Word spread quietly. Other cities asked for sessions. Other sectors. Healthcare, housing, public transit. Evelyn found herself traveling more than she had in years, not as a symbol, as a facilitator. Still, the weight accumulated. One evening alone in a hotel room in St. Louis, Evelyn stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She looked older than she remembered, tired, but steady. She spoke aloud just to hear it. You don't have to fix everything. The next morning, she set a boundary. She declined 3 invitations, postponed another. She chose rest deliberately without guilt. She learned that endurance required pacing, not sacrifice. The backlash never fully disappeared, but it changed shape. It became quieter, less personal, more abstract, harder to aim at a single person. That was progress. At Hamilton, Executive Thomas Reed received a letter from the nonprofit thanking the airport for participating in a listening session. He pinned it to the board in the training room, not as recognition, but as reminder. Linda Carver attended one of the sessions in Chicago anonymously. She sat in the back and listened. When someone spoke about the fear of being dismissed after decades of service, Linda felt tears rise unexpectedly. She didn't wipe them away. Evelyn noticed. She didn't comment. The work continued. Months later, at a small gathering in Denver, Evelyn stood before a group of volunteers who would carry the initiative forward. Younger voices now, different energy, new language. I won't always be here, Evelyn told them, and that's the point. One of them asked, "What if people stop listening?" Evelyn smiled softly. Then you keep listening to each other. That's where it starts. That night, she and David walked through their neighborhood, the air crisp leaves crunching underfoot. A neighbor waved. A dog barked. Ordinary life, persistent and grounding. I think I'm ready to step back, Evelyn said. David nodded. From the spotlight. Yes, she replied. Not from the work. He squeezed her hand. You've already done enough. Evelyn looked up at the stars, faint but visible through the city glow. Enough isn't the same as finished. In the distance, a plane crossed the sky, its lights steady, unremarkable, carrying people who would never know her name. And for the first time in a long while, that felt exactly right. The morning Evelyn Brooks chose to step away felt unremarkable, which was how she knew it was right. She woke before dawn, the house quiet, except for the low hum of the heater. David was still asleep. She moved through the kitchen without turning on the light's muscle memory guiding her hands. Coffee, toast. The same routine she had followed for years long before anyone knew her name. Outside, the sky was pale and undecided. Not quite night, not yet day. She sat at the table and opened her notebook, the one she had carried through airports and libraries and borrowed conference rooms. The pages were filled with names, fragments of stories, reminders written in the margins. She read them slowly, not with urgency, but with gratitude. This chapter was ending, not with a speech, not with applause, with intention. Later that morning, Evelyn and David drove into town. No destination that mattered. Just movement. They passed the community center, where she had spoken months earlier. The library, where the listening sessions had begun. The small diner, where she had once sat alone, wondering how a single moment could stretch into something so large. "You all right?" David said, eyes on the road. Evelyn nodded. "I feel settled." He smiled. He had learned to trust that word when she used it. They stopped at a park on the edge of the neighborhood. Early walkers moved along the paths, collars turned up against the chill. An older man fed birds near the pond. A woman pushed a stroller slowly, carefully. Evelyn sat on a bench and watched. For a long time, she had believed that being seen required standing in the center of the frame. That influence came from attention. She knew better now. Real change didn't announce itself. It lingered. It adjusted the angle of things. Her phone buzzed once. A message from one of the volunteers taking over the listening initiative. Just an update. A reminder that the work was continuing without her in the room. That mattered more than any headline ever could. Back home, Evelyn packed the notebook into a drawer. Not to hide it, to keep it. Some things didn't need to be carried anymore. That afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten. Careful script. It was from the man at the rail yard. He wrote about a new policy at his former workplace. About how retirees were invited back once a month. About how he had sat in the lounge again, not as an exception, but as himself. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it beside the others. That evening, neighbors gathered on their porch for an impromptu get-together. Nothing formal, just chairs pulled, close conversation drifting as the light faded. Someone brought soup. Someone else brought bread. Ordinary generosity, the kind that rarely makes it into stories. A woman across from Evelyn said, "You know, I never realized how often we tell people to move without meaning to." Evelyn nodded. "Most habits aren't loud." Another neighbor added, "I've started paying attention to who waits." Evelyn smiled. That was enough. As night settled, David squeezed her hand. "Do you miss it?" he asked softly. Evelyn thought of the cameras, the panels, the rooms that had leaned toward her words. Then she thought of the quiet bench by the pond, the letter, the shared soup. "No," she said, "I'm where I'm supposed to be." Later, alone in the living room, Evelyn stood by the window and watched the lights of distant aircraft blink across the sky. She remembered the gate, the chair, the feeling of being paused, assessed, set aside. She remembered choosing not to disappear. That choice had carried her farther than she ever expected, not into power, into purpose. The world hadn't become kinder overnight. Systems still failed, people still judged. But something had shifted, a fraction of a degree, enough to change the direction of travel. Evelyn turned off the light and let the room go dark. This story didn't end with triumph. It ended with continuity, with people who would never know her name but would feel the difference in small moments. A greeting instead of a glance, a pause instead of a push, a seat instead of a dismissal. That was the legacy she wanted. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you've seen waiting quietly, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories that honor dignity over drama, and leave a comment with these 3 words: quiet strength matters.